Okay, so before we get started, just two little announcements. One is, for those who don't know, I flew back to Seattle and I'm home again. And I came back last night. I'm so happy. But I apologize if the audio or video quality is different because I'm not using my normal equipment. Number two, I brought the wrong charger. So my laptop is on half battery, and I hope it doesn't run out in the middle of shiur, but either way, I'm going to stop right at the scheduled time and not take questions afterwards. So if you have questions, feel free to email me and I'll respond to them when I can. But I want to conserve my laptop battery because the charger won't arrive for another week. Alrighty, so this topic was selected for this year because of a conversation I think I overheard in Lomdeha this week. Okay, it was just like one comment. So this is a article that pops up from time to time entitled "Chariots in the Red Sea: Irrefutable Evidence." Okay, and the article says this was published on the 24th of October 2014. Basically, it describes a finding by Egyptian's Antiquities Ministry that they found. It says a team of underwater archaeologists had discovered the remains of a large Egyptian army from the 14th century BC at the bottom of the Gulf of Suez, and then there were a bunch of skeletons, and it indicates that it says suggesting that an army of large size perished on that site. Okay, so obviously this is a reference to Kriyas Yamsuf and the discovery of archaeological evidence for the drowning of the Egyptians there. So like I said, this article crops up from time to time. What should you do if you find an article on the internet that is suspicious? What's the one website you should go to? Hopefully someone knows this. Anyone?
Snopes.
Snopes. Okay, Snopes.com, right? So Snopes is a website that whose job it is to investigate claims on the internet and to refute false claims. So obviously it doesn't do all of them, but like this one shows up. So Snopes, if you look on Snopes, it says if one is looking for news of an important scientific or historical discovery, World News Daily Report is not the place to look. WNDR is a fake news site whose disclaimer notes that the site's articles are satirical in nature. And then it has the disclaimer here. It says all news articles contained within the World News Daily Report.com are fiction and are presumably fake news. But nevertheless, this still comes up from year to year and spreads around. Okay, so this led me to the topic, which for this morning is called, the title this year is Some Guidelines for Thinking About Biblical Historicity versus Archaeology. Okay, and the goals or objectives of today's shiur are four, actually, I added one. Number one, to provide some guidelines for thinking about biblical historicity versus archaeology. Okay, and this I emphasize the some guidelines because obviously this is a huge topic and these are just a few guidelines. Okay, there's probably a lot more. Two, to raise questions and discuss problems which fall within the scope of the general topic without necessarily arriving at answers. These questions are relatively new in terms of new to me and new in the Masorah, because archaeology and the field of history are relatively recent. And these are questions that are not discussed certainly not by the Gemara, not by the Rishonim, and even by the Achronim until like post or like 1800s and beyond, and like modern days. So feel free to ask questions. We are not necessarily going to arrive at answers for all these things. Three, to demonstrate how many hidden assumptions, questionable premises, and unwarranted biases lurk behind claims made by archaeologists and scholars of ancient history. And related, four, is to leave you with the impression, I have an agenda here, to leave you with the impression that claims made about biblical historicity by archaeologists and scholars of ancient history should be examined with a critical mind before drawing conclusions. In other words, I mean, you should be skeptical about everything, but I want you to walk away with a feeling that you should be skeptical and critical of claims made by scholars of ancient history and archaeologists. Okay, so that's my agenda. And I want to preface this also by saying that this is, I believe, the first Friday shiur that I'm giving that is outside of my own field. Okay, I'm not a historian, I'm an archaeologist. So there are even more than usual, there will be questions that I just don't know the answers to. This is new to me as well, so I'm going through this as well. I just wanted to kind of present to you my findings. And for this reason, I'm going to be relying primarily on two books, okay? This book is a fairly recent book. I think it was published last year, maybe. by someone named Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University, graduate of Princeton, and got smicha from Gush, from Har Etzion. He is the only one I know. I'm sure there are more, but he's the only one I know who is an Orthodox Jewish scholar of history and archaeology. Okay, he wrote this book called Biblical Criticism, Animami, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and 13 Principles of Faith. He wrote this book explicitly to address the topic that I'm addressing today, which is how does a religious Jew confront the questions and problems and doubts that are raised by modern historical scholarship and archaeology. I have not finished reading the book yet, but so far it's very good. The book is not for everyone. It's in fact, it's not even for everyone in Lomdeha. It will raise lots of questions and doubts and problems that are that might create more doubts and problems and questions. So someday I think you should read it. What I did for this in preparing this is to select certain portions that I think are relevant. And if you have any, if you're interested in this and you want to email me, to ask whether I think it's appropriate for you to read it this time, you feel free to email me, okay? But I'm relying heavily on this. And number two is a book, older book, I think in the 90s or early 2000s by someone named Rabbi Dr. Dovid Gottlieb, PhD in mathematical logic at Brandeis University, professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University. And then he's I don't know if he retired now, but he's a senior faculty member at Or Sameach, which is a yeshiva in Yerushalayim, I think. He actually was kind of instrumental in my family's journey to Judaism. And this book he wrote was basically about rational arguments for Judaism from different angles. And one of his chapters was on archaeology. So because this, again, is outside of my field, more than my other shiurim, this has a heavy percentage. This year is going to have a heavy percentage of just me reading excerpts from their books and then talking about it. It's going to view this as like a guided reading where we're reading and thinking together. So feel free to interrupt me at any time. But a lot of this is going to come from them because they're the experts on these matters. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to present 6 guidelines for how to think about biblical historicity versus archaeology and scholarship of ancient history. And we might only get through 5. I saved the most complicated and the longest for last because depending on how many questions there are, we might not get to this. And so maybe we'll have to do a sequel or something like that. So I'm going to list all of them and then we'll go through them one by one. Number 1, know why you accept Torah. 2, absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. Okay, let me repeat that. Absence of evidence does not necessarily equal evidence of absence. 3, corroboration equals evidence, but not proof. 4, remember how speculative ancient history is. 5, mind the double standard in academia. And number 6, which is the one we might not get to, beware of anachronistic fallacies. Okay, so let's start with number 1. Number 1 is the shortest one, okay? Know why you accept Torah. So Rabbi Berman begins his book, chapter 2, by saying as follows. He says, few issues are as sensitive as the question of the historical accuracy of the Tanakh, and particularly of the Torah. For many people, what is at stake can simply be stated: if the events of Torah the Torah chronicles historically happened the way the Torah describes them, then the Torah is true. If the events in the Torah did not happen the way the Torah says they did, then the Torah is not telling us the truth. It is engaging in fiction masquerading as historical truth. Thus, many religious people feel compelled to affirm and demonstrate that the events of the Bible, all of them, are historically accurate. If even one event can be shown to have happened differently than the Bible's portrayal, the claim that our Tanakh is historically accurate and therefore true will be severely undermined. The stakes could hardly be higher. Now, what he's doing is he's framing the question the way that many religious Jews frame it, that basically, since we claim the Torah is true, and since the Torah is history, then if anything in the Torah is not historically true, then that means that the Torah has falsehood in it, okay? This is the way he's framing the question. He's saying this is the question that most religious Jews have. He is going to disagree with this, and I'm going to disagree with this. In other words, this is not the way we should go about thinking. Now, he gives his reasons for why this is not the way you should go about thinking, but here are my reasons, okay? The question is, why do we accept Torah as true and valid? Now, you'll notice I crossed out the word we. I can't answer for you, okay? There are different people in this here. I can tell you why do I accept the Torah as true and valid, not based on the history in the Torah. Rather, I accept the Torah based on what we call the proof of Torah Misinai, which is the rational argument based on the Torah's claim of a mass revelation which rules out the possibility of fabrication beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning that it rules out the notion that someone made up the events in the Torah. Now, this is not the time and place to review the proof. I don't know which of you have gone over this in previous classes or in your own learning. Maybe we should do this at some point. Either way, I recommend, and there are different versions written by Rabbi Chiat from our yeshiva, from Yeshiva B'nai Torah, wrote a version of this. Rabbi Dovid Gottlieb, in the book that I mentioned, writes a proof. Lawrence Kellerman writes a version of this. There are many different versions of this. It's sometimes called the Kuzari argument, attributed to the Kuzari, but there are different versions of the Kuzari argument. So in my opinion, it's a good idea to review this every couple of years, because your mind is going to be developing, and you need to make sure you're clear on this at all times. Chazal say, you should know how to respond to a heretic. Make sure your conviction in Torah Misinai can stand up to questions and challenges, and that you are clear on the answers. Because what happens is, let's say like you learn this in 12th grade and it's clear to you. And then let's say 2 years down the line, when you're in college, someone poses a question or challenge to this, and you're like, like maybe that undermines my entire conviction in Torah. And then you got to go re-examine it. And this is why I also find it beneficial as a teacher to teach this every few years, because I myself will see new questions and new problems, and it should be clear. So, but even if this is not your basis for accepting Torah, you should know why you accept Torah. And if you feel threatened by arguments based on history or archaeology, make sure that you know why you accept Torah, and make sure it's clear to your own mind, whatever those reasons are. Don't be peer pressured by loud and antagonistic voices, or internet trolls, or like people who are hostile towards Judaism. You should have an inner conviction based on your own reasons, okay? And remember also, at the same time, we had a shiur on is the Torah for or against free thinking, which was about the issue of lo sasru achar levavchem achar einechem, which the Rambam says means that if it's usher to go into an area of thinking about anything that could cause you to uproot one of the foundations of Torah, and you shouldn't go into those areas until your mind is ready to do so. So you should know the limits of your own mind, and don't go into areas that could lead to questions that cause you to reject aspects of Torah if you're not prepared to intellectually or emotionally like tackle those issues. But at the same time, don't engage in intellectual dishonesty, okay? And what I mean by that is, it's okay to say, this is a question on Torah. I'm not ready to handle it yet. I'm going to wait a few years until I have the methodology, or I have the proper ikarim, and then I'll go into it. That's different than saying, these are not questions, okay? In other words, it's fine for you to acknowledge these are big questions or problems with Torah that you can't answer right now, but you're not ready to go into them, okay? So this is like the first point I wanted to make. So any questions on this so far? This is the shortest point in this year. Okay. Now let's go to our first major point, which is a guideline. Absence of evidence does not necessarily equal evidence of absence. So Rabbi Berman says like this. Oh, so he has a chapter here, by the way. One of his chapter 3 focuses on what is probably the biggest historical claim in Judaism, which is Yetzias Mitzrayim. Okay, the entire process of Jews being enslaved in Egypt, being redeemed from Egypt through the plagues, Kriyas Yamsuf, into the Midbar, receiving the Torah, being in the Midbar for 40 years, and then going to Israel. Okay, that whole thing. So the question he starts off with is, what is the big problem with Yetzias Mitzrayim? So he says, the case against the historicity of the Exodus is straightforward, and its essence can be stated in 5 words: a sustained lack of evidence. Okay, you got to do the meme clapping, right? Nowhere in the written record of ancient Egypt is there any explicit mention of Hebrew or Israelite slaves, let alone a figure named Moses. There's no mention of the Nile waters turning to blood, or of any series of plagues matching those in the Bible, or of the defeat of any pharaoh on the scale suggested by the Torah's narrative of the mass drowning of Egyptian forces at the sea. Furthermore, the Torah states that 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60 left Egypt. Adding women, children, and the elderly, we arrive at a population in the vicinity of 2 million souls. There's no archaeological or other evidence of an ancient encampment that size anywhere in the Sinai Desert, nor is there any evidence of so great a subsequent influx into the land of Israel at any time. Okay, so no evidence, all right? No competent scholar or archaeologist will deny these facts. Case closed then. for those who defend the plausibility of historical exodus, what possible response can there be? So it seems like the case is very strong. Okay, so what do? There's no evidence for the exodus. Okay, so here's his answer. Okay, now again, this is a whole chapter in his book. I'm just presenting a few topics for a 45-minute shiur. Okay, a few points. All right, so there's a lot more. Read on if you're interested. But he says, let us begin with the missing evidence of the Hebrews' existence in Egyptian records. It is true enough that these records do not contain clear and unambiguous references to Hebrews or Israelites, but that is hardly surprising. The Egyptians referred to all their West Semitic slaves simply as Asiatics, meaning people from Asia, with no distinction among groups, just as slaveholders in the New World never identified their black slaves with their specific provenance in Africa. So what he means by that is like this, okay? We all know that there were African-American slaves in the United States. Now, if you look through the African-American record, and we know that these slaves came from different places in Africa. I don't know which places, but let's say like Ghana or like Mauritania. So let's say you look through all of the newspapers from America during the period of slavery, and you don't find any reference to Mauritanians or Ghanans. Does that mean that there were no slaves from Mauritania or Ghana? No. Why not? Because the sources in American history refer to those people just as slaves, right? They don't refer to them based on their locations in Africa. So you wouldn't expect to find those named. So too, you're not going to expect to find in the Egyptian records any people called Jews or Hebrews, because that's not how they name them. They just called them Asiatics. Okay, so that's one reason why you wouldn't find you wouldn't expect to find any evidence, any names. Okay, this next one is my favorite point. Okay, you guys know what a papyrus is? Papyrus is the type of paper that they use. Okay, so you would expect to find, if the events of Yetzias Mitzrayim happen, you would expect to find records, right? Wrong. Okay. More generally, this is still Dr. Berman, there is a limit to what we can expect from the written record of ancient Egypt. 99% of the papyri, that's the plural of papyrus, produced there during the period in question have been lost, and none whatsoever has survived from the Eastern Nile Delta, the region where the Torah claims the children of Israel resided. Instead, we have to rely on, okay, so let me pause there for 1 second, okay? In America, there is school. In school, they give tests. Tests are written on pieces of paper, okay? Now, you can imagine, let's say 3,500 years from now, 3,500 years from now, some archaeologist goes back and looks at America, okay? And finds 0 pieces of paper that students had writing for their tests for high school, and concludes, oh, it must be that no tests were ever given in America. Now, obviously, you realize that that's a ridiculous argument, right? Why? Because paper that they used to take the test is not going to last for 4,000 years. So same thing here, okay? Written records on papyrus don't exist. 99% of them don't exist, and then none from the area where the Jews lived or where the events of Yetzias Mitzrayim took place. Okay. Furthermore,
library, wouldn't it be more akin to like the Library of Congress disappearing?
Yeah, you could say that also. Yeah, I mean, and again, this is something that you have to see. Well, how were records preserved back then? And what can we expect or not expect to find? And he makes this next point. He says, instead, we have to rely on monumental inscriptions, which, being mainly reports to the gods about royal achievements, are far from complete or reliable as historical records. They are more akin to modern day resumes, and just as conspicuous for their failure to note setbacks of any kind. Okay, so it'd be like, for example, let's say the only thing you found in America after 3,500 years was the Lincoln Monument and like some other monuments, and you tried to reconstruct all of American history based on those monuments. Probably not a very good system, okay, to get a full picture. He says, we will have reason to revisit such inscriptions later on, but now let us consider the absence of specifically archaeological evidence of the Exodus. In fact, many major events reported in various ancient writings are archaeologically invisible. The migrations of Celts in Asia Minor, Slavs into Greece, Arameans across the Levant, all described in written sources, have left no archaeological trace. And this too is hardly surprising. Archaeology focuses upon habitation and building. Migrants are by definition nomadic. So in other words, if you're going to say, well, how come if there's evidence of all these other ancient events, how come there's no evidence of the Exodus? Well, there's not evidence of many of the major events in archaeology as well. Okay, so in other words, this is normal. Okay, and he goes on. He says there's a similar silence in the archaeological record with regard to many conquests whose historicity is generally accepted, and even of many large and significant battles, including those of relatively recent vintage. Now, remember, I'm going to keep on emphasizing the time frame here. Yetzias Mitzrayim occurred about 3,500 years ago. Okay, he says now the Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain in the 5th century, okay, which is 1,500 years ago, the Arab conquest of Palestine in the 7th century, even the Norman invasion of England in 1066, which is 1,000 years ago, have left scant, if any, archaeological remains. Is this because conquest is usually accompanied by destruction? Not really. The biblical books of Joshua and the Judges, for instance, tell of a gradual infiltration into the land of Israel, with only a small handful of cities said there to have been destroyed. And what is true of antiquity holds true for many periods in military history in which conquest has in no sense entailed automatic destruction. Main point here is that if a person says, oh, I don't believe in the Exodus because there's no evidence, you got to check out what should we expect there to be evidence of, and see, does absence of evidence equal evidence of absence? Meaning, just because we find no evidence, does that mean the event didn't happen? Okay, and this is why it's not so simple to say, oh, there's no evidence the event didn't happen. All right, so that's
especially if we're going through the desert. Like deserts are notorious for glacier. Like I just read a book in like my class, in one of my anthropology classes, and happening right now, like the Sonoran Desert. Like if somebody dies in the Sonoran Desert trying to migrate into the country, like a month goes by, you won't see any evidence, like little to no evidence of that person existed.
Exactly.
Weeks ago.
Yeah, and that's certainly true of the Jews in the desert for 40 years. But then even in Egypt, okay, and I don't have the facts on hand, but if you Wikipedia, don't do it right now, but if you Wikipedia the Sphinx, okay, we all know the Sphinx, right? But so the Sphinx is sitting there right in the area, like around where the pyramids are, okay? The Sphinx got buried by the sand, and like hundreds or maybe 1,000 or maybe more than that years later, it was uncovered by a later period in Egypt, and they had no idea what it was. They didn't know who built it, why it was built, what it was. So even in like Egypt itself, Egypt is, and if you've never, okay, not right now, look through the Wikipedia articles on ancient Egypt and the Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom. Egypt is mind-bogglingly older than you think. Okay, unless you've studied Egypt, it's mind-bogglingly older than you think. Okay, and so we're talking thousands and thousands of years. So it's a question of like what can and can't be found. All right, now switching gears here for a second. Rabbi Dr. Gottlieb, what was the point I was going to make? Oh yeah, so this is in his chapter about archaeology, and he's dealing with the same question. Okay, and these are from lectures, so it's a little bit more informal. Okay, he says like this. Now, in making that evaluation, you must know one fact: all ancient histories were written as propaganda. Okay, and this is something that our 6th guideline, which looking at the time we're never going to get to today, this is probably going to have a 2-part series. Okay, so we'll take our time then. He says, this is something upon which historians and archaeologists agree. The function of ancient histories was to glorify contemporary powers. After all, the scribes were their employees. You see this, for example, in the following type of historical chain of events. Okay, so this is a typical thing. You read in the hieroglyphs that Pharaoh X raised a great army and conquered a number of provinces, and his son, Pharaoh X Jr., raised an even larger army and conquered even more provinces. Then there's a 100-year gap in the history. What happened during that 100 years? For that, you have to go to the Babylonian records. That is where the Babylonians were kicking the stuffing out of the Egyptians. The Egyptians don't record that because that doesn't glorify their empire. They just leave it out. An example is the question of the Exodus. Why is it that no ancient Egyptian records mention the Exodus? The answer is that the Egyptians never recorded their defeats. Therefore, since the Exodus was a massive defeat, you would not expect them to record it. So its absence from their records is not evidence against the Exodus. And I'm going to give an example, which is going to sound political, but it's not, because even Trump supporters will agree with this. If the only record you had of the last 4 years was President Trump's Twitter, what would you think? You would think that he never failed, nothing ever went wrong. He was the greatest president on earth, and all this stuff. It would be a very incomplete record. Why is it? Because as we all know, that's how Trump uses his Twitter, is he only uses it to portray his successes or to talk about how he's being hunted, So it's not a good record. It's not a thorough history book that you would find like in your history class. Okay, this is how all ancient histories were recorded. Now he gives another example. So again, this is another example how absence of evidence doesn't equal evidence of absence. Another example here. And I chose this other example because it illustrates how critical you have to be when you're reading stuff. Okay, Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho. Oh, and by the way, Rabbi Gottlieb cites all of his sources in his book. I just didn't put the sources here, but it's in his book. She says that the best date we have for the entry of the Jewish people into the land of Israel is 1400 BCE. She says that there is a 150-year gap between the destruction of Jericho, and the entry of the Jewish people into the land. Therefore, she concludes that the Jews couldn't have been the ones responsible for destroying Jericho. They just attributed it to their ancestors in order to glorify them. So that's her claim, is there's a 150-year gap, and there's no evidence that the Jews conquered Jericho. Okay, but here's the thing. Now, how did she arrive at the conclusion that Jericho was destroyed no later than 1550 BCE? She based her argument on the absence of imported Cypriot pottery. A certain style of pottery from Cyprus was imported into the area from 1550 to 1400 BCE, and she found none of it at Jericho. Therefore, she concluded that Jericho must have been destroyed earlier in 1550. So she's making this huge claim about the fact that the Jews didn't destroy Jericho because of the absence of pottery of a certain type in a certain time period.
Relative chronology is not that compelling in that sense.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So here's the Rabbi Gottlieb's arguments here. It says, but this conclusion is very weak. It can be attacked in at least 4 different ways. Okay, probably more than that. Number one, method. Conclusions based on what you don't find are always very weak, especially given the fact that we just said so much of what, I mean, think of this, by the way. Think of how many objects in your house are perishable or end up in some sort of the equivalent of like a garbage dump at some point. Okay, I mean, and the same thing was true back then, even though the garbage dumps were different. Okay, 2, she says herself that Jericho was not on any of the major trade routes. Is that where you would expect to find imported property? If it's not on the trade route, how often are you going to get like imported property? 3, she sank 2 shafts into what she herself describes as the poor section of the city. Is that where you would expect to find imported property? In the poor section of the city? 4, she totally ignored the dating of local pottery, which had been found in earlier excavations, which do come from the dates later than 1550 BCE. Now, again, this is an example where if you just read the punchline of her study, you see, oh, expert archaeologist concludes that Jericho was not destroyed by the Jews. But then you read at the actual evidence that it's based on, and you see it's a very, very weak argument. Okay, so once again, the main thing here is absence of evidence does not necessarily equal evidence of absence. Okay, and every case has to be taken in a particular way. You know, for example, like if someone claimed that let's say someone in the future claims that the capital of the United States was not in Washington, D.C., and then you excavate Washington, D.C., and you find no evidence of any Capitol buildings or something like that. Okay, fine, maybe that is good evidence. Okay, but like you have to evaluate each thing on its own. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, yeah. Wow, I really did not plan the timing of this. Oh, that was my other excuse, by the way. Usually I go through our shiur at YBT on Thursday night, but I was on the plane, and so I didn't have time to like see how long this was. Okay, so that's the excuse here. Okay, number 3 is very related, is corroboration equals evidence, but not necessarily proof. Okay, so word of the day, we always have to have word of the day in here, is anachronism. Okay, anachronism has 2 meanings. One is a thing belonging or appropriate to a period other than that in which it exists, especially a thing that is conspicuously old-fashioned. For example, Mr. Shilcroft's overhead projector is an anachronism he is proud of. Okay, all right, but the usage we're going to use is an act of attributing a custom, event, or object to a period to which it does not belong. Okay, for example, the 9th grader asked, what was Rashi's major in college, unaware that she had made a silly anachronism. Okay, this is not a real example, by the way. This never happened. Okay, but so in other words, assuming that Rashi went to college and had a major is basically you taking stuff from your time and projecting it backwards into history and assuming it was the same. So Rabbi Gottlieb is in this part of the chapter addressing the question of if you hold that the Torah is not factual, so then you can assume it is a myth. Okay, that was invented at a later period. So this is in part where he's arguing that the Torah was not a myth. Okay, so here's what he says. One of the many ways you can tell if this myth making goes on is that the people writing the myth project into their past their own conditions of existence. They didn't know that 500 to 1,000 years before, life was very different. They assumed that life was more or less the same as their conditions of life and projected backwards. Then what we find from archaeology is that the conditions were quite different from what was described in the myth. And we know, therefore, that it was a myth. For example, they may have projected back weapons that they didn't have, domesticated animals that they didn't have, trade routes that they didn't have, settlements that they didn't have, and so on. That is how you determine if it was a myth. So there was the same assumption about the biblical account of history before David and Solomon. So in other words, like this, let's say the Greeks, okay? If you find the Greeks talking about a period 500 years before, and you find them talking about things from their own society that exist and that they say existed 500 years before, and then you excavate and find that none of those things were there, good chance they made up a myth and it wasn't a historical event. Okay. However, in the case of the Bible, archaeology has revealed the exact opposite. Archaeology has uncovered a myriad of details that the Bible records about the quality of life and the conditions of life of the patriarchs, which turn out to be accurate to the last detail. These details are accurate in ways that are utterly inexplicable if you think that this is a normal process of myth formation. Here are examples. Okay, and he goes through tons of examples, but here's just a few. So for example, Abraham in all his wanderings is never associated with the northern part of Israel, only the southern part of Israel. Now, in the period to which Abraham is assigned in the Bible, the northern part of Israel wasn't settled. Later, when supposedly the myth is being when supposedly the myth was being made up, it was settled. If someone were writing it later and projecting his conditions of existence on the past, there would be no reason for him to discriminate against the northern part of Israel. In other words, if you're writing about a period 500 years earlier, how would you know which parts of Israel were and weren't inhabited? Another example, this one is much easier to understand. The names Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Lavan, and Joseph, I just mixed them there, sorry, whatever, were in common usage in the patriarchal period and dropped out of usage thereafter. These names appear in the archaeological inscriptions from that period and no later period. In the Bible, those names were used only in the book of Genesis. Now, if someone 500 years later is supposed to be making up the myth, how is it that he just happened to get right the names for the period of that time? Okay, now we know, for example, there are names that go in fashion and out of fashion. For example, you might have someone from your grandmother's generation named Mildred, but no one's naming their daughter Mildred today, okay? Or you might have like a modern name like Skylar or something like that, and people 100 years ago were not named Skylar. So if you find something from an earlier period, and if you're writing about an earlier period, okay, and you're making it up, what are the chances that you're going to get those names right from that exact period? Okay, but if you have archaeological evidence that those were the names used in that period, that supports the notion that you're not making it up now, that it's actually a historical record. Okay, so this is what I mean by corroboration, that it's in line with that. Okay, now Rabbi Berman makes the same point. Many of the details of the Exodus story do strikingly appear to reflect the realities of the second millennium Egypt, the period when the Exodus would most likely have taken place. And they are the sorts of details that a scribe living centuries later and inventing the story afresh would have been unlikely to know. I'm going to summarize these just for the sake of time. For example, where the Jews lived. Okay, so if the entire account in the Torah were made up, and the author who made it up said the Jews lived in Goshen, how would he know? But we find that the Jews lived, or that the West Semitic populations, like the Jews, lived in the Eastern Nile Delta, which is what the Torah calls Goshen, for most of the second millennium. And there were slaves, some of whom were slaves in the court and had Hebrew names like Moshe, or Egyptian names like Moshe. Okay, another one, the name of Pison and Ramses. We know that Ramses II, who we think Paro was, we know that he lived in that time and that he created a city called Pi-Ramses, which is a variation of Pison Ramses. We know that, obviously we know that in Torah we call him Paro, but there were several Paros. So pharaohs during that time period were just called Paro without any particular name. But then later on, for example, in Sefer Malachim, they're called Paro and then a name like Paro Necho. Okay, so we know that the conventions of naming for Paros changed during that time, and that's consistent with our timing in the Torah's record. The names of the other nations that were around at the time, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, were all found in the Egyptian records of that time. Okay, again, if the story is being made up later on, how would the author know that? geography and the features of the land that are described in the Torah are in accordance with the geography and features during the time of the period. It says in, I'm going to read this one, the book of Exodus, this is by in Bashalach, notes that the Israelites chose to not traverse the Sinai Peninsula along the northern coastal route towards modern day Gaza because that would have entailed military engagement. The discovery of extensive Egyptian fortifications along that route from the period in question confirms the accuracy of this observation, right? So again, if you're making it up and you say, oh, the Jews avoided that area because there were armies there, well, how do you know? The fact that there actually were armies there indicates that the story was not made up, but that is the historical record. Similarly, there is an inscription about Israel from the time of 1206 BCE, which is around the time when it was when this was going to occur. And Israel is written in a way that suggests that it was a small group of people, not like an entire nation and not like an individual. So again, all of these are corroborations, okay, of the events. They support the notion that the events of Yetzias Mitzrayim were not made up, but they're an actual historical record. Because if they were made up, what are the odds that the author hundreds or thousands of years later made it up and got all these historical details right and didn't commit a mistake of anachronism of attributing stuff in the past? Okay, is the general point I'm making clear? Because it is a bit of a subtle point. If anyone needs me to restate it, then I can. Okay, one more example from Rabbi Gottlieb, and this is a combo of the last two guidelines of absence of evidence does not necessarily mean evidence of absence. Okay, so Rabbi Gottlieb says, an argument that they used, this is the people who want to claim that the Torah is a myth, an argument that they used that the Torah account that the account depicted in the Bible was a myth was the idea of camels being domesticated. The patriarchs are described as having used camels for transportation. It was assumed that this was an anachronism. Camels were domesticated later, but of course, later people didn't know that their ancestors didn't have camels. And if they had camels, they would have, of course, pictured their ancestors as having camels. Their great ancestors couldn't be any less than they were. So here, let me state this in normal terms here. So the people who claim that the Torah is a myth point to references to camels in Sefer Bereshis, for example, and they say, you see that? The people who wrote the Bible assumed that camels were domesticated 3,500 years ago or 4,000 years ago. But we archaeologists know that camels were not domesticated back then. So you see what must have happened. It must be that Sefer Bereshis was made up, and the authors of Sefer Bereshis had committed an anachronism as they assumed that since they had camels, then their ancestors also had camels. So you see that it was made up, okay? And what's the basis for assuming that? Is that there's no evidence of camels from back then. But guess what happened? It turns out that this was just archaeological ignorance. We have the 18th century BCE Canophorian tablets in northern Syria, which list the domesticated animals and in which the camel is specifically mentioned. Another archaeological discovery depicts a camel in a kneeling position. A seal dating back to this period depicts a rider sitting on a camel. So it turns out to be an accurate report of the details, not a later anachronistic projection into the past. So in other words, like this, for hundreds of years, they assumed that the authors of the Bible had made this up because they didn't have any evidence of camels from that period. But then they find a couple pieces of evidence, and now they say, oh yeah, there must be camels back then. So this is what I mean, is that archaeology, not only is it that the evidence is very, very like minimal, but they're constantly finding more evidence. And when they find new evidence, then they revise all of their theories. Okay, and an example of this, not in archaeology, but you know, like a bunch of little kids, especially, I don't know if this is a sexist thing to say. I feel like boys are much more into dinosaurs growing up than like the typical girls. Maybe that's changed from now, but like when I was growing up, I went through a dinosaur phase, you know? So I remember when I was like 6, there was a dinosaur. I don't remember the name of the dinosaur, but all of the picture books that reconstructed the dinosaur depicted it as this dinosaur with these 2 horns on its thumbs, and the pose in all the pictures was the dinosaur going like this, okay? And then later on, when I was an older kid, let's say like 11 or 12, then they changed the dinosaur to make it look like it had a horn on its head. Now, what happened is that they had found one specimen, I guess, or maybe it was 2 specimens, that the bones were fossilized in a way where they thought that they were thumbs. But then later on, a couple years later, they found another specimen that they found that oh, it's not actually a thumb bone, it was a horn. So they reformulated their entire like model for what the dinosaur looked like. Same thing occurs in archaeology, is that you find one thing or you fail to find one thing and you paint one picture and then you find one fact and then that changes all the history around, you know. And especially with the chronology, this happens, like Shana alluded to. Ancient Egyptian chronology is notoriously hard to pin down. Is they will think that a certain king lived at one period, and then they'll find one more inscription, and then they'll realize, oh, we were off by 500 years, you know. So it's so speculative, and every new piece of evidence that comes into being changes everything, okay, in ancient history. Now, this doesn't happen in modern history, this just happens in ancient history, okay? So that's the evidence but not proof. Okay, this next thing, I think I can make this quick point in 5 minutes, okay? Remember how speculative ancient history is? So there's this great children's book called the Motel of the Mysteries. Here's the synopsis, okay? This is a fake book. The book is written in, I mean, sorry, it's a fiction book, not a fake book, okay? It's a fiction book. It's written to try to show how speculative archaeology is, okay? So here's the plot, okay? It is the year 4022. All of the ancient country of USA, okay, that's a reference to the USA, has been buried under many feet of detritus from a catastrophe that occurred in 1985. Imagine then the excitement that Howard Carson, an amateur archaeologist at best, experienced when in crossing the perimeter of an abandoned excavation site, he felt the ground give way beneath him and found himself at the bottom of a shaft, which, judging by the do not disturb sign hanging from an archaic doorknob, was clearly the entrance to a still sealed burial chamber. Okay, Carson's incredible discoveries. So that's the fake scenario, right? So the USA was covered for 2,000 years, and this archaeologist discovers this thing which he thinks is a tomb. Really, what is it? It's a motel room. Okay, so the whole book is him exploring this motel room and concluding what is it that he's finding. Okay, so for example, this is an excerpt from the book. So the book is illustrated. So this is what he finds here. Okay, now we know that what is this a picture of? It's a picture of a motel bathroom. Okay, but here's an excerpt from the book. Although it seemed hardly possible, the contents of the inner chamber were even more dazzling than those already discovered. Harriet immediately began tagging and identifying each item while Howard drew conclusions. As he had predicted, a second body was present, and this one appears to have been buried with more care and ritual than the first. Wearing the ceremonial headdress, it had been placed in a highly polished white sarcophagus, which had in turn been sealed behind an exquisite and elaborately hung translucent curtain. Okay, you get what's going on here? So we who know American culture, we know that, yeah, it's a guy taking a bath or a woman taking a bath with a what do you call it? What do you call those things they put on here? Not a hairnet, what do you call it? You know, the thing that shower cap. Thank you. Right, shower cap. And this is not a sarcophagus; it's a bathtub, and that's not it's a bathroom curtain. But this person, this guy is theorizing, oh, this was a ceremonial burial, and this was a sarcophagus, right? And he goes on. Some of the music required during the final ceremony was produced by forcing water from the sacred spring through the trumpets and out through a small hole in the floor of the sarcophagus. What is that really? It's the faucet and the drain in the bathtub. Okay. Other music came from the music box, okay, situated above the sacred urn, okay. Articles 1 and number 4 were used in preparing the body for its final journey, and number 5 was the sacred parchment, pieces of which were periodically placed in the urn during the ceremony. We know that it's not a sacred urn, it's a toilet, and it's not a music box, it's a flusher, and it's not sacred parchment, it's toilet paper, right? But this is the whole point of the book, is to show how when you're an archaeologist and you're looking at a site thousands of years old, what are you doing? You're creating a narrative based on your assumptions, which might have absolutely nothing to do with the actual like artifacts, you know? And again, this is not so true of recent history, but this is true of ancient history when you're so removed from the culture. Okay, one last anecdote. Okay, might go 1 minute over here. So, oh, sorry. Actually, no, let's not. I forgot I wrote this. So the moral of the Motel of the Mysteries is archaeologists and scholars of ancient history rely heavily on guesswork and imagination to piece together a story, it's history, right, story about the artifacts they find, which incidentally are very limited in quantity and quality and not sufficient to form a full picture. In this sense, archaeology and ancient history should not be regarded as a hard science, nor should the words of such scholars carry the same weight as that of experts in the hard sciences. It's very easy for us as lay people to see a scientific report from a doctor and a scholarly study from an archaeologist and say, oh, these are both experts and they carry the same weight. No, 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 no. Science, physics, chemistry, medicine, those are hard sciences, much more rigorous criteria. But history, ancient history and archaeology are much more of like the humanities courses, not a hard science, and it's very speculative and based on guesswork. Okay, so that I guess takes us to the end of part 1 of this thing, and I guess we'll have to do part 2 probably the next session when we get back. Okay, if you have questions, then feel free to email them to me. I gotta stop now because of my laptop, and I gotta save battery.
Good Shabbos.
Have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Yeah, have a good Shabbos.
Thank you.
Okay,
Have a good
bye.
Shabbos.